When you play the Game of Thrones, you
Subscribe and like.
or you die. There is no middle ground.
Alright, hello YouTube, welcome back to the Grease Goblins YouTube channel. In today's video, we're going to be doing part 5 of my Blackfyre Rebellion series. And this one is going to be about really the love triangle between Shiera Seastar, Egor Rivers, and also Brynden Rivers. So, this is going to be a very important video because a lot of these characters are going to have major influences in the battles to come and the war. And I will say this is the last prelude video. We'll actually talk about the breaking out of the Blackfyre Rebellion in the next video. I was thinking about doing a Fireball video, but I just feel like this is going on too long that we haven't even really touched the beginning of the war. And one thing about the first Blackfyre Rebellion is it doesn't necessarily last all that long. Like, in terms of Robert's Rebellion, there's a lot of different battles that you need to discuss and a lot of things like that that I did in my series. The first Blackfyre Rebellion is very different in that, even though it has like a very similar effect. Like, you have one really big decisive battle that was very close that could have gone either way at the Red Grass Field. But a lot of the minor battles in that war aren't nearly as interesting as, say, something in like Robert's Rebellion. But we'll talk about all of that in the coming videos. So I want to start with kind of doing individually looking at the three characters, Shiera Seastar, Brynden Rivers, and then Aegor in this video, and then we'll kind of combine them all, talk about how the characters interacted with each other, and what would have possibly been going on before the Blackfyre Rebellion, and what led up to those things happening. So let's start with everybody's favorite, especially Aegor's in chat, Bloodraven, aka Brynden Rivers. So Brynden Rivers was born in 175 AC to Melissa Blackwood. Melissa Blackwood was the sixth mistress of Aegon IV. She was by far the most beloved by even people like, Nerys, Daeron, and even Aemon the Dragon Knight. She was somebody who was well liked at court, even though she was a mistress. She was someone that was held in a very high regard, and she seemed to be a very kind and nice person. And something that's very important to understand here, because we're also going to talk about this when we go to Aegor, is she displaced Lady Barba Bracken. And this is important because a lot of the tensions that you see between the Brackens and the Blackwoods, especially on this generation, is going to come from these mistresses and Aegon, choosing two different Brackens and then a Blackwood. It's just going to take all of those things in the past where, you have the Dance of the Dragon, the Blackwoods and Brackens have issues there. You think about, early on in the Targaryen rule, you think about before the Targaryens ruled, there's been generations and generations of hate towards each side, and things like this is only going to fuel those issues. Now, Brynden did have two older sisters in Maya and Gwen's. That's a weird one as well, but they're not really listed all that much. We don't know too much about them. One thing we do know is that Brynden was able to get a lot of his close connections, a lot of his, maybe spy network or information system. A lot of that came from because of his mother and the popularity that she had. And so he was able to make a lot of friends, even with his appearance. Not only is Bloodraven somebody that's a bastard, he's also somebody that's described as being a pale albino with this red like spots on his face that people thought looked like a raven. Dunk himself doesn't even think it looks like a raven, but that is where he gets like his name, for instance. And so it's quite interesting to think about that, right? You think about all the times where we look at Jon Snow, the way people talk to him, even though he's a bastard, or, Tyrion because he's shorter. You think about both those things would have applied to Bloodraven. He's somebody that is a bastard and also is kind of looking different than everybody else because of his albino skin and because of that spot. So it's interesting to think about how, at least at this point of his life, he was actually able to make a lot of connections. He was able to kind of have an information system building within King's Landing, especially. And the thing is, right, so Brynden would only really be like on the main mistress, like main bastard pedestal for about 2 years. As in 177 AC, his mother Melissa is displaced by another Bracken, something that would very much fuel the anger that Brynden would have had towards the Brackens, is Lady Bethany Bracken, which a very weird and disturbing story. I talked about this with Aegon's video. If you want to go back and watch that one, I look at all the mistresses pretty in-depthly. And Bethany is somebody that was like basically trained how to make Aegon happy by Barbara, which was a very weird thing. But either way, so what I mean when I say that Brynden was able to like make all of these connections, I mean later, in life, of course, not when he was like 2 years old. I mean, because people looked fondly back on his mother, Melissa, he was able to then use those connections. And even though he does like get legitimized later on, people still would have viewed him as a bastard. You think about how Aegon the Fifth, or Egg during the Duncan Egg tales, he still thinks of Bloodraven as being not a true born, and that he's still a bastard. His blood is tainted. You think about the way Maekar talks about him, that you can never trust a bastard. The sentiment of a lot of Westeros believe that. So that's kind of what I mean. I don't want people to get confused and think I'm talking about, yeah, when Melissa Blackwood was still the mistress, because he only would have been two. But that's kind of the point of it. So when you think about Bloodraven, he doesn't really grow up, at King's Landing, because Melissa gets displaced quite early on. So he would have grown up at Raventree Hall, of course, and he would have gotten very connected, it would appear, to the old gods in the Weirwoods. He starts to be able to have some of these visions and probably things like that, ending up being the three-eyed crow, or at least being some servant of him in the normal story. So you think about all of those ideas, and at some point, right, Brynden is going to come back to court. He is going to be somebody that comes tied into the crown. But for his early life, he would have grown up with, his mother and his sisters. And that is something that's interesting, because you think about the same things we're going to talk about with Aegor applied to Bloodraven as well. Bloodraven, in a lot of ways, could have been thinking, okay, if my mother wasn't displaced, I'd be in a much more, different, I'd be in a much maybe better position, all of those things. And so I find that fascinating to his early life. But when we get a little bit further on, we learned that Brynden became a lover to his half sister, Shierra Seastar, or at least he lusted after her early in life. And something that I think is very awkward and weird to think about is that we don't really know how old Shiera Seastar was when the Blackfyre rebellions were happening. We don't know the age difference or gap between Brynden Rivers, but like, put it this way: when the Battle of the Redgrass Field happens, that's in 196 AC. Brynden himself would have been only 21 years of age. And so if you think about Shiera, we have this gap where she was probably born anywhere from 178 AC to like, I think, 184 AC. So at the youngest, Shiera Seastar only would have been 12 years old when the Battle of the Great Grass Field even occurred. At the oldest, she would have been 18. So depending on the age here, you get very weird in terms of the age gap between characters like Brynden Rivers and Shiera Seastar. And it's even worse for Aegor, because Aegor is a couple years older than Brynden. He's 3 years older, so the gap even gets even worse there if you think about it. I mean, you'd have a 24-year-old during the Battle of the Redgrass Field mixed with like maybe 18 or younger for Shiera. Kinda weird. I know from Westerosi standards it's not that weird, I guess, for the people living in that world, but still kind of weird to think about. And you also got to remember, like, the Battle of the Redgrass Field in 196 AC, they were competing for her much earlier than this. Like, it's made very apparent that Brynden and Aegor were fighting like duels for her, and were having this point of rivalry. Like, there's a lot of things that drives their rivalry, right? One of those things being Shiera Seastar, other things being because of their mothers, others because of their generations beforehand. These two characters were set up to fail. It's really the hatred of past generations that fuel this rivalry, and their animosity towards each other. And so eventually, as we get a little further, you have Brynden, and he is legitimized by his father, Aegon IV, in 184 AC, when the king was on his deathbed. Now, the weird thing that I don't know is, at what point was Brynden trying to get with Shiera? Because it seems like the best opportunity would be once 184 happens, because then all the bastards are going to be given some sort of incomes and things like that. Like, Daron tries to keep them quite close, tries to treat them well. And so if, 184, if we're going off of, the earliest date in which Shiera could have been born, which would have been 178 AC, she would have been 6 years old, and Bloodraven at that time would have been 9. So maybe that's when that started, which is still extremely, extremely weird, guys. really trying to point that out because when we get to a Shierra Seastar, I have a lot of comments to make about her as a character early on. But during this time, it becomes very apparent that Bloodraven was somebody that was building up his reputation, trying to build up a bit of his spy network until the Battle of the Red Grass Field happens and the first Blackfyre Rebellion happens. He's trying to gain, I would say, influence more or less. And the one thing that I think is very interesting, about the character of Brynden as we get closer to, the breaking out of the first Blackfyre Rebellion, we get some news about this idea that Daeron is going to declare himself like a month before it even happens, right? And we don't know who tells Daeron this information. It's implied that it would probably be Bloodraven. But the real interesting part of this is, would Brynden have actually maybe even lied to Daeron to get the war kickstarted because he hated Aegor that much, wanted to get rid of him? Or maybe he just saw it was coming, right? Maybe he doesn't even, particularly know that this war is coming, but he just prompts it to start because you want to be on the front foot, not the back foot. All of those things are very interesting to understand. I personally do think that, Brynden was the person that informed Daeron and what prompted Daeron to try and arrest Daemon. I think that all comes from Brynden. It makes perfect sense as to why that would occur. I also think you think about his spy network, you think about his powers and what things that he could have worked into maybe or have seen them declaring. Again, as Dunk says, 1,000 eyes and one. Who knows what was going on there? Brynden could have easily had spies within Daemon's camp. So that's all kind of to catch us up with Brynden, right? He's somebody that at this time has some sort of magical powers, it would seem, or some connection to the old gods. He also has this idea of having a weirwood longbow and arrows and things like that. He has, for instance, a weirwood longbow, and he would become very known for his unit, the Raven's Teeth, who were basically bowmen, but also could be more than that. They're going to play a major role in the first Blackfyre Rebellion. And so let's now move on. I want to talk about Aegor next, and then talk about Shiera last, because I think she's going to be kind of the focus between these two before the actual Blackfyre Rebellion happens. But so let's move then to Egor Rivers. So Egor Rivers, like I talked about, he was born 3 years earlier to Aegon IV and his mistress, Barbara Bracken. Now, he is a very interesting character because it could have been a very different conversation, and he could have ended up being the Daemon Blackfyre character of this generation if things had gone a little differently. Because Aegor was born only a fortnight before Aegon's wife, Queen Daenerys Targaryen, nearly died in childbirth. We talked a lot about this with the Aegon IV video, the Daenerys video, and the Aemon the Dragon Knight video. But yeah, things could have gone very differently if Daenerys would have died here. If Daenerys had died, the idea was going to be that Barbara Bracken would be the new wife of Aegon IV. Then he could legitimize Aegor Rivers and supplant Daeron. And it would feel a little bit more credible than it would based upon what Aegon IV ends up doing or what he was trying to do. He's trying to legitimize, it would appear Daemon Blackfyre, but he couldn't really do that in a way that wouldn't have caused war. Like, this way would have actually made sense. If you're marrying into the Brackens, you then legitimize your kid with this woman, it would have been more, acceptable. And so I think in a lot of ways, the one thing that really drives Aegor is that not only does, he become a bastard and his mother gets displaced by a Blackwood, all this stuff, he also had the opportunity to become the heir to the Iron Throne and all of those things. And that was the plan for a good amount of time there. So Bloodraven and Aegor have this rivalry, not just because of things like Shiera Seastar and past generations, it's because of this as well, right? Aegor falls out of power and possibly becoming king one day, and Bloodraven kind of takes a little bit of that power, right? He is somebody then that becomes a little bit more liked in King's Landing because of Melissa Blackwood. So I think that's very important to understand with his early birth and things going on around that time. But again, the Brackens come out on top again. They displace the Blackwoods, even though, because once Bethany Bracken becomes the next mistress, becoming the seventh, well, things don't exactly go well, because Bethany, she starts messing around with Terrence Toyne, and that resulted in the execution of Toyne, Bethany, and her father, and Aegor's grandfather were all killed. So again, the Brackens kind of go out in a whimper, right? The Brackens were in power two different times. They lose one of their power to the Blackwoods, then they lose it again because of, well, their own stupidity, more or less, or Bethany messing around with some other dude, which basically ended up getting her killed. So during this time period, Aegor and Bloodraven were kind of at each other's throats, and that would have developed a lot because of their parents telling them of what's going on and being bitter at the Blackwoods and the Brackens. We saw this basically perfectly done in House of the Dragon season 2 of the issues between the houses, but it would run a little bit deeper than that because when we get to the point where it's 184 and Aegor gets legitimized and Bloodraven gets legitimized, the two would be much more in proximity, right? Whether that be King's Landing at court, whether it's just being around Shierra, the two would have hated each other from the start, and they kind of have every reason to in a lot of ways, just based upon their upbringing and the way things worked out. These two people were very different in a lot of different ways. But something that's very interesting that happens actually before the first Blackfyre rebellion occurs is that Daemon Blackfyre agreed to wed his daughter Calla to Aegor. Now, I think this is a kind of a power move in a lot of ways for Aegor, because Aegor at this time would have then married into the Blackfyre line, which is, I think, very important for him. It also would have been it would have been seen, I think, if you're Daemon, as you're rewarding one of your most loyal people around you. But I do think it's weird because, again, this person of Calla Blackfyre could have been born anywhere from 185 to 190, not 185 to 195. So at the latest, I mean, there's like a 23-year age gap here. So this was more like of a betrothal than it is actually, Bittersteel marrying Calla. It was more, okay, in the future, this is what's going to occur. So yeah, and then Aegor became somebody that was a staunch, I would say, ally or confidant with the character of Daemon Blackfyre, because Aegor himself would know, and I think he'd be a lot of projecting his own feelings on a Daemon Blackfyre, because once Daemon Blackfyre gets the sword from Aegon the Fourth, there's your claim, right? Where Bittersteel didn't really have much of a claim because of getting passed over with Barbara Bracken, his mother. And because Nerys didn't die, he can project those feelings onto Daemon. Daemon should be the one that becomes king. He's this great fabled warrior. He has the sword, Blackfyre. He, along with somebody like Fireball, really start to push him to become king. Really, that's what he starts pushing. And so I think the character of Daemon Blackfyre, I think, is probably the most interesting here, because what did Daemon Blackfyre really think about becoming king himself? I could very, very easily see a situation where Daemon Blackfyre didn't even think about becoming king. That he just wanted to be this great warrior and, being very chivalrous and all those things. And I think that things would have worn on him, right? When you have people like Aegor and Quentin Ball or Fireball telling him to become king and always being maybe discriminated against because of being called a bastard or something like that. I think things like that could have pushed him to starting that rebellion and making himself king. Now, Aegor would be just a huge commander for Daemon in the future. For instance, in the Battle of the Redgrass Field, Aegor would command the right of Daemon's host. Shows a lot of faith and belief in him. And so, yeah, that's kind of where we're going to end here with Aegor. Another thing to understand with Aegor, he also was lusting after Shierra. I don't know if I mentioned that specifically with Aegor and his little part of this early history for him. But let's then move to Shierra Seastar. Now, Shiera Seastar, in my opinion, is probably the most interesting one of the three at this part of the time period, because there's not much known about her character. She's very much left up to interpretation. If you looked up this character on the Wiki of Ice and Fire, the history section is literally like maybe 3 or 4 sentences. She is very unknown. We don't know much about the character at all. Now, we do know that her mother was Sereni, who died giving birth to her. She was the last of the bastard children of Aegon IV that we know of, but she was named after the Star of the Sea. And Shierra, by all accounts, did come out looking very beautiful. Now, the weird part of this is she was still a child before really the Blackfyre Rebellion even happened. It's even possible that Shiera could have been born on the year that her father died in 184. So it's a really weird situation because Shiera basically grows up without any parents. She grows up without a father and a mother, more or less. If she was born in 178 AC, the earliest this could have happened, she would have had her father for maybe about 6 years, which still isn't all that much. So she grows up without a father and a mother, basically. She's somebody that from a very young age, people are lusting after her, fighting for her. I think Shiera Seastar gets almost this bad rep because of her beauty. She gets compared to, people like Visenya, people like Alicent, people like Ashara, maybe. All these kind of beauties of the realm that people think, oh, that she was bathing in blood to retain her beauty, and she was a sorceress and all this other stuff. And there isn't really a lot to kind of back that up. Um, there's almost no information about her doing anything kind of magical, outside of her just being linked with a character like Bloodraven, for instance. And so I think the most important part of this character is that she refused to ever marry. And I think that was done for a lot of key reasons. One, what does marriage really gain her? When you think about it, with characters like uh, Brynden or Aegor, what does that do for her? It doesn't do anything, really. And I think that what she ended up doing in a lot of ways was for survival, right? Her being single has more value because of her beauty and all those things that people will do things for her. They will try to get in her good graces. It allows her to, in a lot of ways, stay out of some of the situations going on, right? Shiera Seastar, I'm not sure when she started her relationship with Brynden. I don't think it's really ever established, even in the lore. It's just that it happened. I would easily argue that it probably didn't happen until after the first Blackfyre Rebellion, just because of how young Shiera was, but also the fact that Shiera probably was playing the game of whoever wins the first Blackfyre Rebellion, that's who I might go with. But I'm not going to marry them because she never marries, Brynden. And so I think in a lot of ways, Shiera used Brynden for protection, right? She stayed, as his concubine, more or less, or his companion, just to be protected, right? And we even hear, like, Brynden himself says that he desired Shiera to Bram. That's what we assume that means. And so it kept Brynden wanting to impress her, trying to get her and keep her and all these things. Because if Brynden then marries Shiera, well, the whole chase of wanting her and all these things might go away. And then Shiera might be in a sticky situation where he maybe gets put to the side, all of these things. Shiera would have had a first-hand accounting of that, right? Her mother dies, having her to this king that did all those things. He would displace mistress to mistress. And so I find Shiera to be a very fascinating character because I think she's much smarter than people give her credit for. Never marrying, I think, is a very strong move. And I know I'm kind of going a little bit further ahead with the character Shiera. Again, I haven't talked about Shiera much on this channel. I want to give her a little bit of time here because even though she doesn't have a lot, right? There's not a lot to the character. We don't know a ton about her. Even though, okay, this is one thing. If you want to add to the evidence of Shiera possibly being like a sorceress or something, her mother was also possibly had skill in the dark arts, is what is said. Again, don't have a lot of information to back that up. We just know that that's something that was a thing that could have been a rumor started by people that didn't like Nareni because she was from Lys. She was more foreign to Westeros. So I don't know. That's kind of up there in the air. But Shiera doesn't really have that big of a role in terms of the first Blackfyre Rebellion that we know of, outside of just pitting people against each other. Pitting Bloodraven and Aegor against each other. She never picks between them, it would seem, until after the first Blackfyre Rebellion. If I had to make a guess, my guess is that Shiera played both sides until one side won or the other. That is the smart thing that I think she would do. Now, is that true? We don't know. We don't know. We just know that eventually Brynden does get the chance to actually sleep with her, and he is the person that is like with her, I guess, more or less, without the like official titles. And so during, the lead up to the first Blackfyre Rebellion, Shiera is still very young. Not a lot that she really does that influences it that we can really predict here. Maybe she could have been using some sort of sorcery to help Bloodraven in the events to come, but that's just very hard to speculate on because there isn't a whole lot there to prove that. Outside of we know that Brynden is magical. So did Shiera have some part of that or not? And even Brynden himself doesn't actually even mention Shiera as being helpful in terms of magical. But something you could also think about Shiera is she could be a spy, somebody that would be very good at getting information from people. Or Brynden, right? She's somebody that's very beautiful. Some men would want to talk to her and maybe tell her some things that they probably shouldn't. That then could get back to Brynden Rivers. You just see how all that kind of plays out. And so that's where we're going to end today's video. I wanted to talk about the core three, that kind of trio, that triangle pyramid of love or whatever, and kind of show one, it's very messed up. You think about what Shiera was going through. She had two dudes that were older than her, depending on her actual birth, much older than her, fighting over her. And you see how she navigates that landscape. You see how this could have possibly led to more hate between both sides, leading them to choose which side they're going to be on. And so, yeah, that's going to get us really into the first Blackfyre Rebellion, where we're really going to focus a lot on Daemon in the next episode. We're going to kind of look at his perspective as the war starts to break out, and even his younger days getting to the Blackfyre Rebellion. We're going to talk about everything from his side of things until we get to the Red Grass Field. Then we'll look at everything from the Loyalist side, so the Red Dragons. We'll look at what they were going through at the beginning of the first Blackfyre Rebellion. Then we'll have a Red Grass Field video. So that'll be the big battle. And then we'll have probably a wrap-up, a conclusion of where everything goes and why it leads to the next Blackfyre Rebellions in the future of the kingdoms. But I hope you guys all enjoyed, and I'll see you guys all in the next one. Bye, guys.